My family mocked me for years, calling me the broke failure of the family. But what they didn't know was that I was secretly a millionaire. I had won the lottery, and instead of celebrating, I decided to test them. What I discovered shocked me, broke my heart, and changed my life forever. Ethan never thought much about the lottery. For him, it was like tossing coins into a wishing well, something you did half-jokingly, knowing the odds weren't in your favor, but secretly holding on to that little ember of hope that maybe, just maybe, the universe would smile on you. He was 32, living in a modest one-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio. His life wasn't terrible, but it wasn't particularly bright either. He worked long shifts at a warehouse, stacking and hauling, clocking in at 6 a.m. sharp, clocking out when his body already ached enough to remind him of his father's words. Hard work is noble, Ethan, but don't expect it to make you rich. One chilly Friday evening in December, Ethan stopped by a small convenience store on his way home from work. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. He grabbed a sandwich, a bottle of water, and on a whim, a single scratch-off lottery ticket. The cashier, a gray-haired man with heavy glasses, gave him a tired smile. "Big dreams tonight?" he asked, sliding the ticket across the counter. Ethan shrugged, tucking it into his pocket. Just for fun. It's been a long week." When he got home, his apartment greeted him with its usual silence. A crooked lamp stood by the couch. The heater rattled weakly, doing its best to fight the Ohio cold. He dropped his bag on the floor, set his sandwich on the coffee table, and pulled the scratch-off ticket from his pocket. He sat there for a moment, staring at it. "It's just a piece of cardboard," he thought. "You'll scratch it, lose, and toss it in the trash like always." But something about the stillness of the room, the quiet hum of the heater, made him pause. He picked up a coin from the table, pressed it to the silvery coating, and began to scratch. One number revealed itself. Then another. Then another. His hand slowed. His breath caught. The numbers aligned up. His coin slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the table. He stared at the ticket in disbelief. His eyes scanned the symbols again and again, as if expecting them to change. He counted once. Twice. 3 times. The prize amount glared back at him in bold letters. $42 million. For a long time, Ethan just sat there in silence. His sandwich lay untouched, the heater rattled on, but the world around him felt muffled, like he was underwater. His mind spun with conflicting thoughts. Joy. Fear. Disbelief. He whispered it out loud, just to hear the words. 42 million? That can't be real. He picked up the ticket again, turning it over in his hands, half expecting it to vanish, to reveal itself as some cruel joke. But it stayed there, solid, heavy with possibility. Most people might scream, jump, call their friends, their family, their neighbors, post about it online, maybe even film themselves celebrating. But Ethan didn't move. He didn't laugh. He didn't cry. Instead, a strange calm washed over him. It wasn't relief. It wasn't excitement. It was clarity. His father's voice echoed in his mind again. Money changes people. It makes them see you different. Sometimes worse. Ethan pictured his family. His parents, who often reminded him that his younger brother had gone on to graduate school while Ethan was still figuring things out. His cousins, who laughed at his cheap old car at family gatherings. His co-workers, who joked that he'd always be the warehouse guy. He thought about how many times he had quietly paid for coffee when a friend forgot their wallet. How often he'd swallowed pride when family asked him for favors, but rarely returned them. And in that moment, an unsettling thought rooted itself deep in his mind. If I tell them, they'll never look at me the same way again. I won't be Ethan anymore. I'll just be money. A wallet with legs. He leaned back on the couch, the lottery ticket pressed against his chest. What would happen if he told his parents? They'd smile, hug him, congratulate him. But then what? Would every phone call afterward be about a small loan or a little help with the mortgage? Would the warmth of family dinners be replaced by whispers about how he spent his millions? What about his siblings? Would they resent him? Envy him? Maybe even hate him? The thought twisted his stomach. No, he told himself. This is mine. Not just the money. The choice. The peace. I don't owe anyone this knowledge. The decision came slowly but firmly, like a curtain being drawn shut. He wouldn't tell a soul. Not his parents. Not his siblings. Not his closest friends. No one. Ethan stood, the ticket trembling in his hand. His legs carried him to the small desk in the corner of the room where an old, metal lockbox sat tucked beneath a stack of papers. He unlocked it, placed the ticket inside, then snapped the box shut. But even then, it didn't feel secure enough. Not for something that carried the weight of an entirely new life. The next morning, Ethan went to the bank. The world outside carried on like nothing had changed. People rushed to work, kids laughed in the street, cars honked at red lights. And Ethan, blending in with his winter coat and gloves, walked into the bank carrying a secret that could rewrite his entire existence. The banker, a young woman with polite efficiency, guided him to a safe deposit box. She handed him the key, and Ethan slid the small metal drawer open. He placed the folded lottery ticket inside. For a moment, he just stared at it, the slip of paper that separated his old life from a new one. His hands lingered on it, as if saying goodbye to the Ethan who had struggled paycheck to paycheck. Then, with a final deep breath, he closed the box, locked it, and slid the key into his pocket. Standing there in the dimly lit vault, Ethan whispered under his breath, words that no one else would ever hear. "This changes everything." And yet nothing. He walked out of the bank with steady steps, his heart strangely calm. The world outside looked exactly the same. The sky was gray, the streets were wet from last night's snow, and strangers brushed past him on the sidewalk. But Ethan knew. Deep inside, he carried a secret worth $42 million. And from this moment forward, every choice he made would be guided by one silent, unshakable truth. No one could ever know. Ethan's life didn't change on the surface. That was the strange part. He still woke up every morning to the faint rattling sound of the old heater in his modest one-bedroom rental apartment. The blinds creaked when he pulled them open, and his view was nothing glamorous, just a cracked parking lot with faded lines and a few cars that looked as tired as the people who drove them. One of those cars was his, a dusty, 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the back bumper that he had stopped noticing years ago. To anyone watching, Ethan was still the same man, 32 years old, a low-level IT support guy who came home tired, heated frozen dinners, and spent weekends streaming movies on an aging TV. But deep inside, Ethan carried a secret that made every mundane detail shimmer with possibility. He had $42 million in the bank. What surprised him most was the calmness. He had expected excitement, euphoria, maybe even recklessness. But what he felt was control. Power, yes, but a quiet kind, the kind that whispered, "You don't have to live like this anymore, but you choose to because you can." And that choice changed everything. At work, when his boss barked at him for taking too long to fix a software glitch, Ethan didn't flinch like he used to. He nodded, fixed it at his pace, and walked away. In his head, he almost laughed. "You could fire me right now, and I wouldn't care. I could buy this whole office and turn it into a coffee shop if I wanted to." But he said nothing, kept his cool, and went back to his desk. To his co-workers, he was still the quiet guy with wrinkled shirts and cheap shoes. What they didn't know was that Ethan had opened an investment account under a discreet trust name. He had hired a financial advisor, anonymously of course, and was carefully spreading the winnings around bonds, stocks, real estate funds. Nothing flashy, nothing traceable back to him directly. He wanted security, not attention. But he did test the waters of wealth in secret. One Friday night, instead of heating a frozen pizza, Ethan drove an hour out of town to a quiet restaurant with a 5-star rating he had only ever read about online. He sat alone at a table, ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than his weekly groceries, and for the first time in years, he tasted what luxury felt like. Not the wine itself, it was good, though he barely knew the difference, but the knowledge that he could afford it 1,000 times over and no one in the room would ever suspect it. He left a generous tip, almost too generous, then slipped back into his Civic and drove home like nothing had happened. The following month, he tested another secret indulgence, a quiet trip to Colorado. He booked a small cabin for himself near the mountains, spent a week hiking trails, sipping coffee on the porch, and breathing in the kind of fresh air he thought he'd never have time for. He didn't post pictures. He didn't tell anyone where he was. It was his private world, his private reward. When he returned to Ohio, his co-workers asked why he looked so rested. He just shrugged and said, "Stayed home, caught up on sleep." No one questioned it further. But if the outside world hadn't changed, his family certainly hadn't either. At Sunday dinners, Ethan sat at the long dining table in his parents' house, surrounded by the same voices that had always made him feel small. His older brother Mark loved to brag about his new house, his new car, his promotion at work. Mark's wife would nod smugly beside him, sipping wine and adjusting the diamond bracelet Mark had gifted her. His younger sister Lily was no different. She'd roll her eyes and call Ethan Mr. Barely Getting By, whenever he admitted he was still renting his place. Ethan had learned to take the jabs in silence. But that didn't mean they didn't sting. One evening, over roast chicken and mashed potatoes, his mother gave him that disappointed look she had mastered over the years. She leaned forward, her voice soft but cutting. "You know, Ethan, your brother just bought a beautiful house. 3 bedrooms, a big yard. You should see it. Maybe it's time you got serious too. You're not getting younger." The words hit him, but he forced a smile. "That's great for Mark, Mom. Really?" Across the table, Mark smirked and added, "Don't worry, Ethan. When you're ready to settle down, maybe I'll help you with the down payment. You know, older brother privilege." He chuckled, clearly enjoying the performance. Ethan laughed softly, but inside, a different voice spoke. "I could buy 10 of your houses and still have more than enough to never work again." But he didn't say it. He couldn't. Instead, he looked down at his plate, letting the conversation drift away, while his mind repeated the vow he had made the night he won. "If I tell them, they'll only see me as money." That night, lying in his small bed in his rental, Ethan stared at the ceiling, the glow of the streetlight outside cutting across the wall. He thought about what his mother had said, about how his family measured his worth only by the things he didn't have: a house, a new car, a wife, kids. In their eyes, he was failing. But the irony made him smile. He wasn't failing. He was testing, watching, waiting. His inner voice grew sharper each day. "They think I'm the broke one, the disappointment. But soon I'll see who they really are. When they think I'm down and out, when I ask them for help, then I'll know. And that's when everything will change." The thought comforted him, because even though he lived as though nothing had happened, Ethan knew the truth. Everything had changed. And not one of them had any idea. And so, he kept the mask on. He drove his old car, clocked in at his dull IT job, and sat through family dinners filled with comparisons and mockery. But behind the mask, he was quietly shaping a new life, one they'd never see coming. Ethan woke up one gray Saturday morning with a peculiar thought pressing on his mind. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled his apartment, the muted daylight leaking through the blinds, giving his small living room a pale glow. He sat at the edge of his couch, staring at his old phone in his hands. For weeks, he had been carrying this secret, nurturing it like a fragile flame, $42 million quietly tucked away, invisible to everyone but him. He hadn't told a soul, not even his closest family. But the secrecy weighed on him in strange ways. Not in guilt. No, Ethan felt no guilt about keeping it hidden. It was something else, something colder, almost clinical: curiosity. How would people really treat him if they didn't know he was wealthy? How much of their love, their loyalty, their so-called family bond was genuine, and how much of it had always been conditional? That morning, he decided it was time for the first test. He scrolled through his contacts until he stopped at his sister's name, Laura. Laura, his older sister, had always been the golden child. She had a steady job as a nurse, a husband who earned well, 2 kids who became the pride of family gatherings. Their parents doted on her, always pointing to her as the example Ethan should follow. Ethan, on the other hand, was the wanderer. The one who had bounced between jobs, rented instead of buying, drove his beat-up car into his 30s. Family dinners were always peppered with subtle comparisons. Laura just refinanced her home. Laura's kids got straight A's again. Laura and Tom are planning another vacation to Mexico. And then the inevitable glance at Ethan, like an unspoken question mark. So Ethan pressed her name. His thumb hovered for a second, then tapped call. The ringing seemed to stretch on forever until her voice finally crackled through, brisk and slightly distracted. "Hey, Ethan. What's up? I'm getting ready to take the kids out, so make it quick." Ethan forced a casual tone, masking the experiment underneath. "Hey, sis. Listen, I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important. My car broke down again last night, and the repairs are going to set me back. I just need a little help to get through until payday. About $200 should cover it." There was a pause on the other end. Not silence. No, Ethan could hear the faint sound of her exhaling sharply, like she'd been asked for something outrageous. When she spoke, her words were clipped. "Ethan, I really don't know if I can do that right now. Things are tight. You know how it is. The kids need school supplies. Tom's been covering some extra bills. I mean, maybe you can ask Mom. She might be able to help." The way she said it wasn't just hesitation, it was dismissal. As though his request was a burden she wanted to push off onto someone else. Ethan kept his voice steady, but inside, something in him twisted. "Yeah, sure. I understand. Don't worry about it. Okay, good. Sorry, I just can't right now. I'll talk to you later, all right?" And just like that, the call ended. Ethan sat there in the silence of his apartment, the cheap blinds rattling slightly as a breeze passed outside. He stared at the phone in his hand, the rejection ringing louder in his head than her actual words. $200. That's all he had asked for. For Laura, it would have been a small favor, especially considering the family dinners where she often bragged about her bonuses or Tom's overtime. And yet, she couldn't part with it. Or maybe she simply wouldn't. That night, Ethan found himself scrolling through Facebook out of habit. His thumb stopped on a post from Laura. There she was, smiling with shopping bags dangling from her arms, posing in front of some boutique downtown. The caption read, "Treat yourself. You deserve it. #self-care, #retail therapy." His jaw tightened. Just hours after refusing him, she was boasting about a shopping spree. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. She could help, he thought, the words forming in the back of his mind. But she wouldn't. Not unless there was something in it for her. And for the first time, Ethan saw his sister clearly, not as the flawless daughter their parents always paraded, but as someone who measured relationships by what she stood to gain. The test had been small, almost trivial, but the results were loud and undeniable. The following week, Ethan replayed the phone call in his mind while he went through the motions of his daily routine. He drove his old sedan to work, sat at his cubicle, typed up reports that no one cared about, and smiled politely at coworkers who never asked him to lunch. To the outside world, Ethan was just another underachiever living paycheck to paycheck. But inside, he carried the knowledge of who he really was now, a man who could buy and sell everything around him with the swipe of a pen. And yet, he kept the facade. He wore the same worn shoes, carried the same battered backpack, and lived in the same cramped apartment. Because the experiment wasn't over. Laura's failure to show kindness had only confirmed Ethan's suspicions. He needed to know more. He needed to test them all one by one. Still, Laura's words haunted him at night. Maybe ask Mom. It wasn't the rejection itself that cut deep. It was the tone, the dismissal, the way she had made him feel like a burden instead of a brother. Ethan began to wonder, had it always been this way? Had his family's support always been conditional, hidden behind polite smiles at Thanksgiving dinners and hollow congratulations at birthdays? Or had he just never looked closely enough before? Now, with millions secured in a bank vault and investments quietly growing in accounts no one knew about, Ethan had the freedom to test the truth. He no longer needed their approval. He didn't need their handouts or their validation. He had nothing to lose by pulling back the curtain. And that freedom, that terrifying, exhilarating freedom, gave him clarity. Laura had failed. But what about the others? His mother, who constantly compared him to his brother Mark. His father, who had long ago stopped asking about Ethan's career and instead gave him lectures about responsibility. And Mark himself, the shining star of the family, the one with the big house, the steady income, the picture-perfect life. Ethan knew what he had to do. The first test had revealed cracks in the foundation. The next would show whether the whole structure would crumble. He shut off his phone and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling of his dim apartment. "They think I'm the failure," he whispered to himself. "But soon, I'll see who they really are." His lips curved into a faint smile, calm, controlled, but laced with something colder. The first test was complete. The game had only just begun. The request was simple. Almost too simple. Ethan had rehearsed it in his head for 2 days before he finally dialed the number. He knew what he was doing. He knew it wasn't about the money. It was about peeling back the mask and seeing what was underneath. "Mom," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. I'm a little short this month. Rent came due and my paycheck doesn't quite cover it. I hate to ask, but could you help me out?" The silence that followed was long enough for Ethan to count his own breaths. He pictured her standing in the kitchen, phone cradled between her shoulder and cheek, stirring something on the stove. His mother was always multitasking. She never gave one thing her full attention, not even her children. Finally, she sighed. "Ethan, you're 32 years old. When will you learn to stand on your own 2 feet? We can't keep bailing you out every time you mess up." Her voice was firm, but carried that familiar undertone of disappointment that had shadowed Ethan's life since childhood. She didn't scream, didn't scold. Her disapproval was quieter, sharper, like a needle slipping under the skin. Ethan swallowed. "It's just $200. I'll pay you back next payday." She clucked her tongue. "We already helped you enough. Your father and I can't just throw money around, Ethan. We have to think about retirement, about the future. Maybe you should start doing the same." Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the blank wall of his apartment. Retirement. Future. He had $42 million sitting in accounts that none of them knew about, money multiplying with each careful investment he made. He could buy his parents a retirement villa in Florida tomorrow if he wanted to. He could pay off their house, their debts, every bill they'd ever had. He could give them a future so secure they'd never need to worry again. But he didn't say that. He let the silence sit heavy before his father's voice came onto the line. "Ethan," his dad said, steady measured, the way he always spoke when he wanted to deliver lessons. "You're 32. Stop acting like a child. We all have responsibilities. We all have to work hard. If you can't manage your money by now, then maybe you need to reevaluate your choices. You can't keep expecting handouts." The words hit Ethan like little stones, not hard enough to bruise but sharp enough to sting. He almost smiled at the irony. His father had no idea that Ethan could buy and sell the very company where his father worked for 30 years. He could wipe away every mortgage, every worry. But to them, he was still the weak one, the lost one, the disappointment. Ethan forced a chuckle, though it came out thin. "Yeah, you're right, Dad. I'll figure it out." "That's the spirit," his father said, satisfied. "You've got to learn responsibility. Nobody's going to hand you a good life. You have to earn it. Nobody's going to hand you a good life." Ethan bit back the bitter laugh that wanted to rise. Life had handed him $42 million with the scratch of a coin. But maybe that was the point. Maybe money didn't change how people saw you, not unless you showed it to them. To his parents, he was still the boy who hadn't lived up to expectations. When the call ended, Ethan sat in silence. He stared at the small crack running down the wall beside his bed. He thought about the apartment, its peeling paint, the radiator that hissed in the winter, the neighbors arguing through the paper-thin walls. He could walk away from all of it right now. He could buy a penthouse downtown or a cabin in the mountains. But he stayed because he needed to know. He needed to know who his family really was when they thought he had nothing. Later that night, Ethan drove past his parents' house. The lights were on. Through the window, he saw them sitting at the dinner table, laughing with his brother Mark, who was holding up a glass of wine. Ethan parked across the street and watched for a while, invisible, a ghost outside his own family's life. They didn't look worried about retirement. They didn't look like people who couldn't spare $200. They looked comfortable, happy, secure. His mom had always adored Mark. Mark, the son who bought a house, who had a wife and kids and a good job. At every family dinner, she compared Ethan to him. "Look at your brother," she'd say. "Why can't you be more like Mark?" Mark, who lived in the house Ethan could have bought 10 times over. Mark, who probably believed Ethan was still barely scraping by in his tiny apartment. Ethan clenched the steering wheel, not out of anger, but out of something heavier. A strange mix of sadness and power. Sadness, because in that moment, he realized his parents didn't actually see him. They never had. To them, he was a project, a problem, someone to be fixed. Power, because he knew the truth. He wasn't the failure they thought he was. He had everything. The irony tasted bitter in his mouth. Over the next few days, Ethan replayed the phone call in his head. His mother's sigh. His father's lecture. The dismissal, the subtle judgment. He wondered if they even thought about him after they hung up, or if they went back to their dinner and their laughter with Mark without a second thought. "Maybe this is what I needed," Ethan whispered to himself one evening as he tucked the winning ticket, still locked in its safe deposit box, further into the shadows of his mind. "Maybe this is how I see them for who they really are." He began keeping mental notes. Every comment, every dismissive glance, every moment where his family showed him where he ranked in their hearts. He didn't lash out. He didn't correct them. He simply listened, stored it away, a quiet ledger of loyalty and betrayal. At the next family dinner, his mother said it again. "Your brother just bought a house, Ethan. Isn't that wonderful? Maybe one day, when you get serious, you'll be able to do the same." Ethan smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, maybe one day." But inside, the voiceover was already playing in his head. "They saw me as weak. They thought I had nothing. But I had everything." And he knew then, this was only the beginning of the test. The night was heavy with silence. Ethan sat on his worn-out couch, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling of his modest apartment. The hum of the refrigerator in the background felt louder than usual, filling the emptiness of his thoughts. He had gone through his sister's refusal, his parents' dismissal, and the cold indifference that seemed to run through his bloodline. Each test chipped away at something inside him. Each rejection carried the sting of betrayal wrapped in the thin disguise of practicality. He poured himself a glass of water, sipping slowly, letting the cool liquid steady him. That's when a name drifted into his mind, uninvited but comforting: David. David Miller had been Ethan's best friend since childhood. They met in middle school, two awkward boys who didn't quite fit in. David was tall and lanky with hair that never stayed in place, always cracking jokes to cover the nervousness in his voice. Ethan was quieter, more observant, preferring to sit on the sidelines rather than step into the chaos. But somehow, their differences had formed a bond that lasted decades. Through high school crushes, part-time jobs, and long nights studying for exams, David had always been there. Now in his 30s, David wasn't doing much better than Ethan, or at least the Ethan everyone else saw. David worked long shifts at a local hardware store, living paycheck to paycheck, his dreams of becoming a mechanic buried under the weight of bills and family responsibilities. Still, he carried himself with a resilience Ethan admired. For days, Ethan had debated whether to call him. He didn't want to burden David with his loneliness or his strange experiment of testing loyalty. But one evening, as the walls of his apartment seemed to close in, he finally picked up the phone. "Hey man," Ethan said when David answered, his voice low, hesitant. It's been forever," David's voice burst through, warm and full of the same energy it carried when they were teenagers. "What's going on?" Ethan hesitated. He had rehearsed what to say, but now it felt clumsy on his tongue. I don't know. I've been feeling kind of alone lately. My family, He stopped himself before revealing too much. He couldn't let David know about the lottery. Not yet. Not ever, maybe. "They what?" David pressed, voice softening. "They're just not there, you know. I asked them for a little help recently. Just a couple $100 to get me through until payday. And the way they looked at me, the way they talked to me, it was like I was some kind of failure. Like I was begging for scraps." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then David sighed. "Man, you know your family. They've always had their own little ways of making you feel less. That doesn't mean you're worthless." Ethan swallowed hard. His throat felt tight. "Yeah, I guess." "No, not I guess," David interrupted firmly. "Listen to me. You've always been there for me. When my car broke down in college, you gave me your bus pass for the whole semester, so I could get to class. Remember that? You didn't even complain about walking in the rain. And when my mom got sick, you stayed at the hospital with me for nights. You've always been there, Ethan. So don't you dare think you're some kind of burden now." The words cracked something inside Ethan. He blinked back tears, pressing the bridge of his nose. David had reminded him of things he'd almost forgotten, moments where he wasn't invisible, where his presence mattered. "Thanks, man," Ethan whispered. There was a pause, then David said something that nearly knocked the breath out of him. "Listen, if you're really strapped for cash, I can spot you a little. I don't have much, maybe $500 I can pull together, but you can have it. No questions asked." Ethan froze. His chest tightened. He wasn't prepared for this. "David, no. I can't let you do that. You've got bills, your mom." "I said no questions asked," David cut in. His voice carried a mixture of firmness and affection. "You're my brother. Blood doesn't matter, money doesn't matter. We've been through worse. If you need it, it's yours. End of story." Ethan couldn't speak. He stared at the floor, tears burning his eyes. He thought of Laura bragging about shopping sprees while denying him $200. He thought of his parents dismissing him as a child who refused to grow up. And here was David, barely scraping by himself, offering him money he couldn't afford to spare, without hesitation. Voiceover. "In that moment, I realized, sometimes strangers love you more than family. Sometimes, the people you choose mean more than the people you're born with." They talked for another hour, drifting into easier subjects, the old teachers they hated, the time they skipped school to watch a baseball game, the awkward crushes they never confessed. For the first time in weeks, Ethan laughed. Not the fake smile he wore at family dinners, not the forced chuckle at work when colleagues made dull jokes, but a real laugh that loosened something heavy in his chest. When the call ended, Ethan sat in silence, staring at his phone. He didn't take the money. He couldn't. But the offer alone had been enough. It was more than his family had ever given him. Not in words, not in actions, not in trust. That night, he poured himself a glass of the expensive wine he kept hidden in the back of his cupboard. He raised it to the empty room. "To David," he whispered. "The only brother that ever mattered." The taste was rich, velvety, a sharp contrast to the bitterness in his heart. He leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the warmth settle. For the first time since winning the lottery, Ethan felt like he wasn't completely alone. But deep down, he also felt something else stirring, a realization, a shift. If David, a man with almost nothing, could give so much, then what did that say about the people who had everything yet chose to give nothing? His mind replayed his parents' words. You need to grow up. We already helped you enough. He heard his sister's dismissive tone. I don't have money to throw away. Maybe ask Mom. The contrast was searing. The phone call with Mark still echoed in Ethan's ears long after it ended. He had rehearsed the words a dozen times before finally pressing the call button, his heart thumping in his chest, not because he needed help, but because this was yet another test. He had framed his voice with the perfect tremor of desperation, saying the words slowly, carefully, like a man teetering on the edge of collapse. Mark, I don't know what to do. I might get evicted this month. I just need help for 1 month, maybe a little loan, just until I catch up. For a brief second, there was silence on the other end. Ethan wondered, hoped maybe, that his brother's heart might crack open, that he might hear the voice of family compassion. But instead, Mark laughed. Not the kind of laugh that came from disbelief or nervousness. It was cruel, mocking. Ethan, Mark sneered, you made your choices. Don't drag me into your failures. You're 32 years old, still living like a college dropout who never got his act together. You want me to hand over my hard-earned money because you can't survive on your own. Ethan forced himself to stammer, to act embarrassed. I just thought. You thought wrong, Mark cut him off. I've got my own family to take care of. I'm not wasting my money on you. Grow up. The line went dead before Ethan could even respond. He sat there in his small, modest apartment, staring at the cracked wall in front of him. Outside, traffic hummed along, life going on as if nothing had happened. But inside, Ethan's chest burned with a mixture of sadness, anger, and something else he couldn't quite name. He had expected disappointment, but the coldness in Mark's voice had pierced deeper than he thought possible. Later that week, the betrayal took on a sharper edge. Ethan had been scrolling through his sister Laura's Facebook page, her endless selfies with shopping bags, her captioned pictures of brunches and cocktails, when something unexpected appeared in his feed. A cousin had tagged both Laura and Mark in a post about a family dinner. Ethan hadn't been invited, of course. He rarely was these days. But then he read the comments. Mark had written, "Yeah, at least we don't end up like Ethan, pathetic, broke, always asking for handouts. Some people just never grow up." Laura had liked the comment. Others had chimed in with laughing emojis. Ethan stared at the screen, his throat tightening. He scrolled back up, reading it again and again, as if maybe the words would change. But they didn't. There it was, out in the open, his own brother dragging his name through the mud. Not in private, not even in a heated argument, but casually, socially for others to see. The sting went far beyond money. This wasn't about a loan. It was about respect, about family, about the very people who had raised him in the same house now treating him like he was less than human. He whispered aloud, his voice barely audible in the stillness of his apartment. "You'll regret underestimating me." The days that followed stretched long, heavy with unspoken fury. Ethan went about his routine as though nothing had changed, driving his old car, logging into his dull IT job, forcing a polite smile when coworkers asked about his weekend. But inside, he was not the same man. At night, he'd sit by the small desk in his apartment, the dim yellow lamp casting shadows across his notebooks. On one page, he scribbled investment notes, numbers, plans. On another, he jotted down phrases, thoughts that bubbled up after hours of replaying his brother's laughter in his head. They think I'm weak. They think I'm broke. They think I'm nothing without them. He would pause, then write slowly, deliberately. But I am free. And I am watching. It wasn't just Mark's words. It was the way the whole family dynamic had always tilted against him. He thought back to childhood, how Mark had been the golden boy, praised for every achievement, every step. Mark is so responsible. Mark is so smart. Mark is the one who will take care of us. Meanwhile, Ethan had been the dreamer, the one who fiddled with computers, who got lost in books, who never quite seemed to fit the mold. Back then, he had shrugged it off. But now, with millions in his possession, silent, hidden, he saw it all differently. The years of subtle dismissal, the sighs at dinner when he mentioned an idea, the constant comparisons to his siblings. They had shaped him into someone invisible. And now, invisibility was his greatest weapon. Because what they didn't know, what they could never imagine, was that Ethan wasn't asking for money out of desperation. He wasn't broke. He wasn't lost. He wasn't weak. He was testing them. He was studying them. And with every failure, every refusal, every laugh at his expense. They were revealing exactly who they truly were. One night, unable to sleep, Ethan went for a walk through his quiet neighborhood. The winter air bit at his face, but the cold cleared his mind. He passed by houses glowing with warm light, families gathered inside. He thought about the family dinners he used to dream of, the kind where parents beamed with pride, where siblings supported each other, where love wasn't conditional. Instead, his reality was a family that measured worth in bank balances and status symbols. A family that turned its back when one of their own reached out. As he walked, Ethan muttered to himself, each word forming clouds in the frigid night air. They'll never know what it feels like to be me right now. To hold millions and still be treated as if I'm worth nothing. They'll never know what it's like to sit on power, so heavy it could crush them if I chose. They'll never know, until the day I decide they should. When he returned home, Ethan sat down at his desk again. This time, he didn't just write in his notebook. He opened his laptop and began drafting documents. Ideas. Not just investments anymore, but strategies. Scenarios. What happens, he wrote, when the truth comes out? He pictured Mark's face, stunned, speechless, the arrogance draining from him like water from a cracked glass. He pictured Laura, scrambling to explain why she hadn't helped, why she had mocked him instead. He pictured his parents, realizing that the son they had scolded and dismissed was the very son who could have lifted them all higher. But Ethan wasn't ready for that moment yet. The reveal would come, yes. But not now. Not when emotions were raw and revenge felt too easy. No, Ethan wanted patience. He wanted to let the betrayal marinate, let it sink deeper into his bones, until the day came when the truth wouldn't just shock them, it would shatter them. The betrayal had cut him open, but in its own way, it had also freed him. For years, Ethan had secretly longed for his family's approval. He had wished for validation, for them to finally look at him and say, "We're proud of you." But now he saw the truth. That approval was never going to come. Not because he wasn't worthy of it, but because their love had always been transactional, conditional, shallow, and Ethan was done begging for it. Ethan stood on the edge of a gravel driveway, staring up at a house that didn't even feel real. It wasn't just a house, it was an estate. A sprawling modern mansion set back behind wrought iron gates, hidden by rows of towering maple trees. The kind of place he used to drive past in Ohio and think, that belongs to someone else. Someone who won at life. Now it was his. But no one, not his parents, not his siblings, not even Laura with her judgmental sighs, would ever know. The real estate agent had congratulated him with wide eyes when the paperwork went through. Ethan had smiled politely, shaking her hand, then instructed her to make sure the property was bought under the name of a trust. A completely anonymous, untraceable entity. On paper, Ethan didn't own anything but his modest rental. But in reality, he now held the keys to a place that could silence every sneer his family had ever thrown at him. And yet, he didn't move in. Not right away. For weeks, Ethan drove by after work, parking his dented old car down the street, just to sit in the driveway and look at it. He imagined throwing a Christmas party there, watching his family step through the doors, their jaws dropping, their eyes wide with disbelief. He imagined the moment they'd finally realize that the broke one had outgrown them all. But he wasn't ready. Not yet. At home, his life looked the same. Same dull IT job, same peeling beige paint on the walls of his rental, same frozen dinners in the microwave. His co-workers still made small talk about promotions and new cars, and his family still mocked him during Sunday dinners. Mark just upgraded to a Tesla, his mom said proudly one evening, her fork tapping against her wine glass. Ethan, when will you at least trade in that junk you drive? It's embarrassing. Ethan forced a smile, poking at his food. I like my car. It works. Mark snorted from across the table. Yeah, if you're okay with looking like a delivery driver. I swear, man, don't you care what people think of you? His sister Laura chimed in, smirking. He doesn't. Ethan's just simple. Everyone laughed. Everyone except Ethan. Inside, his thoughts burned. Simple? Delivery driver? You think this is my limit? You think you know me? He swallowed his anger with a sip of water and let the laughter echo. They thought they were laughing at me. Really, they were exposing themselves. Ethan's life became a double existence. By day, he was the same quiet, overlooked figure his family dismissed. But in private, Ethan was building something far greater than they could imagine. He opened accounts in multiple banks, spreading his fortune carefully, never drawing attention. He began studying investments late into the night, poring over real estate listings, startup opportunities, and blue-chip stocks. Every calculated risk he took grew his wealth. Slowly, he wasn't just rich from luck, he was rich from skill. An empire was taking root beneath the surface. He funded a coffee chain through silent partnership, disguising his name behind corporate structures. He bought 3 apartment complexes under different LLCs. He even invested in a struggling software company that reminded him of his own IT job, except this company had real potential. Within a year, it doubled in value. Ethan never flaunted any of it. To the world, he still lived modestly. He still drove the old car. He still wore the same budget jackets. But every insult from his family now rolled off his shoulders like rain, because he knew something they didn't. He was the richest man in every room they mocked him in. Still, the lies sometimes weighed heavy. On a quiet Friday night, Ethan sat in his dimly lit apartment, a takeout container half empty on the counter. His laptop screen glowed with numbers from his latest portfolio check. He had just crossed $60 million in assets, more than he could ever spend in 10 lifetimes. And yet, here he was eating cold lo mein out of a carton. He thought of calling David, his only true friend, just to talk. David, who had offered him $500 when he thought Ethan was broke. David, who never asked for anything in return. But Ethan held back. The secret had grown too large. Once shared, it could never be contained again. Instead, he whispered to the empty room. They don't deserve to know. Not yet. His family, meanwhile, continued their performances. At Thanksgiving, his mom set the table with her best china. Mark arrived in designer clothes, bragging about his new promotion. Laura showed off a diamond necklace her boyfriend had bought her. When it was Ethan's turn to speak about what he was thankful for, he smiled gently and said, "I'm just thankful to be here with family." Laura smirked. "Well, at least you've got that." Mark added under his breath, "Yeah, since you don't have much else." The table erupted in laughter again. Ethan laughed with them this time. A soft, almost eerie laugh that made Mark glance at him twice. Voiceover. They thought I was powerless. But every insult was fuel. Every doubt was a seed. And one day soon, I'd let it all bloom. The mansion sat waiting, empty but alive with potential. Ethan had begun furnishing it quietly, piece by piece. No flashy deliveries that would raise suspicion, just curated shipments to storage, then private transfers. A wine cellar stocked with vintages his family would never recognize. A library filled with leather-bound books. A theater room larger than Laura's entire apartment. On weekends, Ethan sometimes walked barefoot across the marble floors, the silence of the house wrapping around him like a secret. He'd stand on the balcony overlooking the rolling lawn and whisper, "Patience." Because he wasn't just planning to reveal his success. He was planning the moment of truth. The day his family would finally see the empire they had mocked into existence. And yet, there was still doubt inside him. One night, Ethan lay awake in his modest bed back at the rental, staring at the ceiling. His family's words replayed in his mind. Failure, simple, delivery driver. What if, when the truth came out, they didn't change? What if money couldn't fix the cracks in their love? The thought lingered, heavy and unsettling. But Ethan pushed it aside. He wasn't doing this for their love anymore. He was doing this for something colder, sharper, respect. Because deep down, he knew they didn't deserve his love. The evening carried a certain electricity, though no one could quite explain why. Ethan had spent weeks planning this dinner, rehearsing every move in his head like a chess player mapping the endgame. His family thought of him as the same broke Ethan, the brother who couldn't hold down a better apartment, the son who always seemed one step behind. But tonight would be different. He booked a table at the Silver Oak, one of the most prestigious restaurants in downtown Columbus. It wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into casually. It was the kind of place with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and valet parking out front. Ethan had called ahead, arranged the best private dining room, made sure every detail was impeccable. When his parents, his brother Mark, and his sister Laura arrived, confusion immediately crossed their faces. His mom whispered sharply as the maitre d' led them inside. "Ethan, this place looks expensive. Are you sure you can afford this?" Mark smirked, half laughing. "Yeah, did you find a Groupon or something?" Laura, always sharper with her tongue, leaned in with a mocking smile. "Ethan, if you're paying, I might actually order dessert tonight." Their laughter bounced off the marble walls, careless, cruel in the way family can be when they think they know your limits. Ethan just smiled, calm, collected. Inside, his heart thudded with quiet power. The dinner went smoothly at first. Waiters in black suits carried plates of seared salmon, truffle pasta, filet mignon cooked to perfection. The family marveled at the food but occasionally exchanged looks of suspicion, as though waiting for the catch. Ethan barely touched his meal. He was too busy watching them, studying the way they carried themselves, how they assumed superiority in every gesture. Mark raised his glass at one point and said, "I still don't get how you pulled this off, Ethan. Last week you said you were behind on bills. Now you're treating us here? What changed? Did you finally get that promotion at your dead-end IT job?" Laura giggled, swirling her wine. "Or maybe you're just maxing out another credit card. Don't expect me to bail you out when the collectors come knocking." Their mom added, shaking her head with weary disapproval, "Ethan, this isn't funny. If you're trying to prove a point, you don't have to waste money like this." Ethan didn't argue. He let their words hang in the air, let them expose themselves, all while he remained calm. His silence unnerved them more than any defense could. Finally, dessert arrived: gold-dusted tiramisu, rich chocolate soufflés, crème brûlée with sugar crusts that cracked beneath silver spoons. The family leaned back in their seats, laughing, chatting, still unaware that the real feast was yet to come. Then Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out 4 plain envelopes. He placed one in front of each of them: his mom, his dad, Mark, and Laura. His movements were deliberate, slow, like a magician about to reveal the final trick. "What's this?" Laura asked, suspicion in her tone. "Open it," Ethan said softly, almost in a whisper. They exchanged confused glances before tearing them open. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Inside each envelope was a crisp check, $10,000, signed, dated, legitimate. His mom's hand trembled as she held hers up to the light. "Ethan, what is this? Where did you get this kind of money?" Mark's eyes widened, greed flashing before he could mask it. $10,000 each? Are you serious?" Laura's jaw dropped, the sarcasm on her tongue dying instantly. "Ethan, you how?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, folded his hands calmly. His voice was steady, firm, with a quiet authority none of them had ever heard from him before. "Sometimes," he said, "the ones you underestimate the most are the ones you should have stood by." The room fell into stunned silence. For years they had mocked him, dismissed him, written him off as the failure of the family. And now here he was, dropping checks on the table like breadcrumbs, hinting at a truth so much bigger than they could comprehend. His dad finally spoke, his voice a mix of disbelief and pride he was too stubborn to admit. "Son, I don't understand. Where did this come from? Did you win something? Did you hit it big?" Ethan just smiled, that same calm smile he had worn all night. "I've been smart with my choices. That's all." Laura leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, suspicion mixing with curiosity. "Smart? Ethan, this isn't some little savings account. Nobody just hands out $10,000 checks like they're gift cards. What aren't you telling us?" Mark, ever the opportunist, laughed nervously. "Hey, who cares where it came from? If he wants to share, I'm not complaining." He tucked the check back into the envelope and slid it into his jacket pocket, already claiming it as his own. But Ethan noticed something. Not gratitude. Not warmth. Not love. What he saw in their eyes was calculation. They weren't asking, "Are you okay?" They weren't saying, "We should have believed in you." No, they were wondering, how much more does he have? How much can we get out of him? Ethan sipped his water slowly, letting them wrestle with the shock. In his mind, this was only stage 1. A taste. A seed planted. They still thought small. 10,000 was a fortune to them. They had no idea it was crumbs compared to what he truly held. For years they mocked me. Called me the poor one. Treated me like the failure. Tonight was just a glimpse, a reminder that the tables had turned. But the real reveal, the true unveiling, was yet to come. As the dinner wrapped up, the family walked out of the restaurant in stunned silence. His mother kept glancing at him with suspicion, as if trying to see through him. His father patted his back stiffly, uncertain whether to be proud or afraid. Laura clutched her check like a lifeline, her mind racing with theories. Mark, meanwhile, kept grinning, already fantasizing about how he'd spend it. And Ethan? He stayed behind a moment, standing alone in the private dining room, his reflection staring back at him in the grand mirror on the wall. He whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." The next few weeks after that dinner felt like living in a different reality. Ethan had gone from being the invisible, mocked, broke one in the family to suddenly being the shining star everyone wanted to orbit around. For years, his phone had been quiet, calls from family were rare, and when they came, they were usually laced with criticism or veiled pity. But now his phone wouldn't stop ringing. It started with his brother, Mark. One morning, Ethan was sipping coffee in his small rental kitchen, the same chipped mug he'd been drinking from for years, when the screen lit up, Mark. Ethan almost laughed. His brother never called, except maybe on birthdays out of obligation. "Ethan! My man!" Mark's voice burst through, overly cheerful, like a salesman with a pitch. "Been meaning to catch up. How you doing, bro?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. There it is. The change. He could hear it in Mark's tone, the forced warmth, the sudden interest. A week ago, Mark had laughed in his face when he asked for help. And now Mark spoke as if they'd been best friends all along. "I'm fine," Ethan said calmly. Mark wasted no time getting to the point. "Listen, I've been thinking. You've obviously been doing well, clearly made some smart moves. I was wondering if you'd be interested in letting me help you with your investments. You know, I've got some great contacts. I've dabbled in real estate, stocks, the works." Ethan almost choked on his coffee. Mark had once lost money trying to flip a house and spent years blaming the market instead of his reckless spending. Now here he was, trying to angle himself into Ethan's financial world like a parasite finding a fresh host. "I'll think about it," Ethan lied smoothly, knowing full well he'd never hand his brother access to even a cent. Later that day, Laura called. She never even tried to hide her motives. "Oh my God, Ethan," she squealed into the phone. "I'm so proud of you. I knew you'd make it one day." Ethan smiled bitterly. She knew. He remembered her voice just weeks earlier, sharp and dismissive, telling him she couldn't spare $200 because money doesn't grow on trees. He remembered her bragging about buying luxury handbags while he supposedly struggled to pay rent. "What changed?" he asked softly, testing her. "What do you mean?" she said, her tone dripping with feigned innocence. "You didn't think much of me before." There was a pause, long enough to hang in the air like smoke, before she laughed it off. "Oh, come on. That's family. We joke, we tease. You know we've always believed in you." Ethan said nothing, letting the silence stretch. She grew nervous and rushed to fill the void. "Anyway, I was thinking, you must have some great contacts now. Maybe you could help me out with a little business idea. Just a small loan to get started, nothing major." There it was, the real reason. Not pride, not love, just greed dressed up as affection. Ethan ended the call politely but firmly. He knew what she was doing. The most surreal moment came with his parents. The very same people who had scolded him, who had told him he was a failure, who had shaken their heads at his choices, suddenly couldn't stop talking about him. He found out through neighbors that his mom was now bragging about him at church. "My Ethan," she reportedly said with a proud smile. "He's finally made something of himself. Always knew he would." And his dad, the man who once called him a child at 32, now paraded around telling old friends, "My boy's sharp. Smarter than people gave him credit for. That's my bloodline." Ethan sat in his small apartment one night, scrolling through social media, and saw the evidence plastered everywhere. Photos of his parents smiling at gatherings, talking about their successful son. Successful. The word stung. Not because it wasn't true, but because they had only just decided it was. To them, success wasn't about his character, his loyalty, his struggles. It was about the dollar signs they now saw dancing in his orbit. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above him. They didn't change. They just smelled money. The truth crystallized in his heart that night. Nothing about them was different. Their treatment of him wasn't born of love, wasn't born of respect. It was born of convenience. As long as he looked like a failure, he was worthless. But now that he looked like a success, suddenly he was family again. But Ethan wasn't naive anymore. He knew better. And so, while his family scrambled to cozy up to him, Ethan quietly turned his attention elsewhere, to the one person who had never treated him differently based on money, David. David didn't know the whole truth. He didn't know about the $42 million. He only knew Ethan seemed to be doing a little better. But he didn't ask for anything. He didn't hint, didn't beg, didn't manipulate. Instead, he still called Ethan to hang out at their usual diner, still split the bill down the middle without question, still treated him as he always had. Ethan remembered the night weeks earlier, when he'd pretended to be broke and desperate, and David had offered $500 without hesitation, money he barely had. That memory burned bright in Ethan's chest. That moment had revealed something rare, real love, real loyalty. And so Ethan decided quietly, David would be the one he would bless most. He started small. He paid off David's credit card debt without saying a word, arranging it anonymously. Then, he found a way to cover David's overdue medical bills. The biggest move came when David admitted one night, over beers, that he'd always dreamed of opening a small woodworking shop but never had the funds. Ethan listened silently, his heart swelling with a mix of sadness and resolve. A week later, David got a call from a lawyer. A trust had been set up in his name, fully funding his dream shop. The lawyer wouldn't reveal who was behind it, only that it came with no strings attached. When David called Ethan later, shocked and grateful, Ethan just smiled through the phone. "Sounds like the universe finally decided to pay you back for all the good you've done, man." David chuckled. "Well, whoever did it, I'll never forget this. You know, some people chase money their whole lives. Me? I just wanted a place to build things with my hands." Ethan sat there in silence, blinking back tears. That's the difference, he thought. David values the simple joys. My family only values appearances. As weeks turned into months, Ethan's world split cleanly in two. On one side, his family clawing for a piece of him, showering him with hollow compliments, suddenly remembering his birthdays, inviting him to every gathering as if he were a trophy to display. On the other side, his quiet acts of kindness toward David, who had no idea just how deep Ethan's pockets ran but loved him all the same. And with each passing day, Ethan grew surer of the truth. His fortune wasn't just money. His real fortune was clarity. The tables had turned. The people who once mocked him now chased him. The ones who called him a failure now pretended they always believed in him. But Ethan knew better. He wasn't going to let them use him. Not anymore. The months rolled by like silent waves, and Ethan's world had transformed in ways no one around him could comprehend. On the outside, to those who only looked casually, he was still Ethan, the broke one, the one who never quite made it, the one who seemed ordinary. But behind closed doors, within the walls of his carefully built empire, he had become something entirely different. He was a man who had seen the truth, tasted both betrayal and loyalty, and risen above the shallow judgments of the people who were supposed to love him most. The time had come. Ethan decided to stop hiding, not to flaunt, not to boast, but to reveal and to teach. He wanted his family to finally see themselves in the mirror he had been quietly holding up for them. So, one crisp Saturday afternoon, Ethan sent out invitations to his entire family. Not for dinner in a restaurant this time, but to his new home. The mansion stood quietly on the edge of a secluded neighborhood, surrounded by manicured gardens, tall gates, and a driveway lined with sleek cars. It wasn't the kind of house anyone could mistake for a rental. It was grandeur, tastefully designed, elegant yet undeniably expensive. When his brother Mark pulled up in his SUV, his jaw nearly dropped. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered to his wife. His sister Laura, dressed as though she were attending a red carpet event, clutched her handbag tighter and whispered, "There's no way Ethan lives here. Maybe he's house-sitting." Their parents arrived next. His mother's eyes went wide, darting from the sprawling lawn to the marble pillars at the entrance. His father cleared his throat nervously, as though suddenly embarrassed by all the years of calling his son a failure. Inside, Ethan was calm. He wore a simple shirt and jeans, nothing flashy. But as he opened the grand oak door, his presence was different, grounded, unshakable, confident in a way they had never seen before. "Welcome," he said, his tone gentle yet carrying a weight that silenced them all. They walked into a foyer that gleamed with chandeliers and polished marble floors. The living room looked like something out of a luxury magazine. Art on the walls, soft leather couches, a fireplace that roared with controlled warmth. The air itself seemed to whisper of wealth, success, and stability. The family sat down, restless, glancing around, whispering among themselves. Laura finally broke the silence. "Ethan, is this really your house?" "Yes," he said simply. Mark laughed, though it was shaky. "Okay, come on. What's going on? Did you win the lottery or something?" Ethan paused. The silence stretched. His parents leaned forward. His sister's eyes widened. And then, softly, he said the words that shattered every assumption they had ever made about him. "Yes, I did." Gasps filled the room. $42 million. Ethan's voice didn't waver. "I won it. Years ago. And I never told anyone." They stared at him as though he had grown wings. His mother put her hand to her chest. His father muttered, 42. Laura's lips parted, speechless, and Mark's expression twisted into disbelief, envy, and sudden, hungry calculation. Ethan continued, his voice steady. "I didn't tell you because I wanted to know the truth. About who you were. About who I could count on. I tested you. I asked for small help, tiny things. $200. A little rent. I wasn't really broke. I just wanted to see. Their faces grew pale as the memories rushed back, the excuses, the dismissive words, the laughter behind his back. When I had nothing, Ethan said slowly, you gave me nothing. You looked at me as a burden, an embarrassment. When I had everything, suddenly you wanted to be close, to brag about me, to act like you'd always believed in me. Laura's eyes filled with tears. Ethan, I didn't mean. Yes, you did. His reply cut like a blade, but there was no anger in it. Just clarity. And that's okay. I needed to see it. I needed to know who I was dealing with. Mark shifted in his seat, defensive. We just thought you were irresponsible, man. We didn't know. That's exactly the point, Ethan said, his gaze locking onto his brother's. You didn't know. You didn't try. You assumed the worst. You mocked me. You spread stories about me. You treated me like a failure without once stopping to think, maybe I just needed kindness. His parents sat stiffly, the shame heavy on their shoulders. His father finally spoke. Son, we didn't realize, we thought tough love would push you. Ethan shook his head. No, it wasn't tough love. It was abandonment dressed as advice. When your child comes to you and says, I need help, and your response is mockery or dismissal, that's not love. The room was quiet now, filled with only the sound of the fire crackling. Ethan leaned back, his voice calm. I want you all to understand something. Money doesn't change who we are. It only reveals it. And what I saw in all of you was conditional love. Love that existed when there was benefit. Love that disappeared when there wasn't. That's not love at all. Laura's tears spilled. Mark looked furious but trapped. His parents looked broken, unable to meet his eyes. Ethan stood slowly, his presence towering over them. I will help in small ways. I won't see my family suffer. But the real gifts, the real generosity, will not go to those who abandoned me when I was poor. They will go to those who stood by me, without knowing what I had. He smiled faintly, almost wistfully. To David, who offered me $500 when he barely had 50 to his name. To causes that matter, to people who give without expecting in return. That's where my fortune will go. The silence was suffocating now, filled with shame, regret, and the echo of every selfish choice they had made. Some cried. Some begged. His mother whispered, please forgive us. His father muttered, we can change. Laura tried to take his hand, pleading, Ethan, I love you, I always did. But Ethan only shook his head gently. Love cannot be bought, and loyalty cannot be faked. He walked to the grand window, looking out over his estate, his voice softer now, almost like a closing chapter. I may have won millions, but I also won clarity, who truly mattered, and who never did. His family sat in silence, broken reflections of their former arrogance, staring at the man they had underestimated and lost. As for Ethan, he didn't feel hatred. He didn't feel revenge. He felt peace. The peace that comes when you finally see the truth and accept it for what it is. And in that peace, he knew his future was brighter than it had ever been. Not because of the money, but because he finally understood where to place his heart. He turned back one last time. Dinner is ready. Let's eat. The lesson hung heavier than any fortune ever could. And that was my story. I may have won millions of dollars, but what I truly won was clarity. Clarity about love, loyalty, and what really matters in this life. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching.